2020 was a pretty crazy year, mainly due to the fact that it didn't quite go as many of us had planned. But despite that, I still had a pretty good year. I visited several parks and got a total of 18 new credits. So to wrap up this year, I thought I would just rank all the new credits I got this year from worst to best. Now, I would like to say that a decent amount of these, almost half of them, are actually either really bad or kiddie coasters, so just keep that in mind. But with those things out of the way, let's get straight into the list. Alright, so starting off at the bottom, we have the Zamperla Kiddie Coaster at Hershey Park, Coco Cruiser. Now, this ride just sucks. It is painful, it is jerky, it is rough, it is just a torture trap. It should be child abuse, it should be considered that. It is just really bad. That transition into the helix is just terrible. It's just so rough throughout. Fortunately, it only goes around 2 times instead of a lot of kiddie coasters going around 3 times. So that's not quite as bad, but it's just a really, really bad coaster overall. Easily the worst coaster at Hershey Park. Alright, so at number 17, we have another coaster at Hershey Park, and this is Sidewinder, and this is easily the worst boomerang I've ever ridden. The vests are super tight, definitely a lot tighter than I remember the ones on Blue Hawk and Flying Cobras being, and it's just super rough. It's just shaky and jerky and just painful. The inversions are just terrible. I mean, I guess the drops are decent, but just the rest of the ride is just so bad, and it's just really not enjoyable at all. And just definitely the second worst coaster at Hershey Park. Alright, so at number 16, we have Wild West Express, the Zamperla Windstorm at Adventure Park, USA. And this ride just sucks. It's so bad. It's so shaky. It really doesn't even do that much. This element right here, this dive, really throws you. Okay, that's the one moment where it actually is pretty intense. But honestly, it was almost too jarring to enjoy. The ride is so shaky for not even doing much. It doesn't have a ton of intensity or really a ton of laterals, and it's just not an enjoyable coaster at all. I know some people I've talked to like this ride, but I just did not like it, and it's definitely the worst coaster at Adventure Park USA. Alright, so at number 15, we have Python Pit, the E&F Miler Kiddie Coaster at Go Karts Plus. Now, this is a decent kiddie coaster. It's actually pretty intense for one. But it is a bit jerky, but it does actually have some nice little pops of airtime at the end of the ride. But overall, it's a kiddie coaster. It's really nothing too special. So it's right here towards the bottom of the list. Alright, so at number 14, we have Tumbleweed, the Miler Kiddie Coaster at Adventure Park USA. Now, this is another pretty decent kiddie coaster. It has some nice little tiny bits of floater airtime. It has some decent laterals on the drop and the turn into the station. It's actually interesting, the ride hop sent my turn around 6 times, probably because there was a kid in the back who was enjoying it quite a bit. But yeah, it's a pretty typical kiddie coaster, so there's really not much to say about it. Alright, so at number 13, we have the final kiddie coaster on the list. This is Grover's Alpine Express, the Zero Kiddie Coaster at Busch Gardens, Williamsburg, and it's a pretty decent ride. The 2 helixes give some pretty good laterals, and it is a pretty smooth ride. But at the end of the day, it's nothing too special because it is just a kiddie coaster. Alright, so at number 12, we have Laugh Track at Hershey Park. Now, this is the Mauer spinning coaster at the park, and I put spinning coaster in quotation marks because it doesn't really spin. Now, even I tried to off-balance the weight of the car. Me and Kyle rode together. One of us sat backwards and one of us sat forwards, and we sat on the opposite side. One of us sat on the right, one of us sat on the left, and even though we didn't spin, but it's still a decent coaster. I saw it backwards, and the backwards drop was really good. Definitely the best part of the ride. But other than that, it doesn't really have much forces or airtime. It's kind of just meanders around. But I do like all the lights and cool funhouse theming and stuff. And the queue line is pretty cool. But it's really nothing too special. So yeah, that's Laugh Track. Alright, so next up at number 11, we have Wildcat at Adventure Park USA. Now, this was my first Schwarzkopf Wildcat, and it's a decent ride. However, my main complaint is it didn't have any airtime. There's some drops where it looked like you could definitely get some pretty good airtime, but it didn't come out of my seat once. But this ride does have some pretty good laterals and some decent positives on some of the turns, especially the final helix. At the end of the ride gets some really, really, really good laterals. And it is a pretty smooth ride, but overall it's just solid, but nothing too special. And the brakes at the end are a pretty hard stop, so definitely prepare for that. But otherwise, it's just a decent ride, but it definitely is my favorite ride at Adventure Park USA. Alright, so starting off the top 10, we have Rocky Top Mountain Coaster. Now, due to time and weather reasons, this was the only Alpine coaster I was able to do on my Pigeon Forge trip. But it was a really, really good ride. It's a super long ride. It gives almost 10 minutes of ride time, and it has like 4 lift hills and also some really cool theming, which you don't really see usually on Alpine coasters. So some cool like buildings and props and stuff. My complaint is the coaster sections in between each lift hill are pretty short, mainly because there's so many lift hills. But it's a really, really good ride. It's some great laterals. The finale's a really, really great ending. It's 2 really intense helices. Most of the ride's just really intense helices, but it's overall a really good coaster. Definitely my second favorite Alpine coaster. Not quite as good as Dragon's Tail, but a little bit better than Goats on the Roof. And it's just overall a really good coaster. Alright, so at number 9, we have Invader at Busch Gardens Williamsburg. Now, it's definitely my least favorite major coaster at the park, but it's pretty solid. It's a pretty good GCI family wooden coaster. It has a pretty good drop, some pretty good pops of airtime, even some ejector, and the turns get some pretty good laterals. There's a decent helix at the end of the ride. It's also really smooth, and the lack of seatbelts definitely helps the airtime. It's nothing too special, but overall for a family coaster, it's really solid. Definitely a really, really fun ride, and definitely a good addition to the park. Alright, so coming out the number 8 spot is going to be Loch Ness Monster at Busch Gardens Williamsburg, the Aerodynamics Loopy coaster at the park. Now, this is my least favorite major steel coaster at the park, but it's still a really fun ride. The drops give some really great sustained standing ejector air. This turn right here gives some really, really nice laterals. The loops are actually really, really forceful. You really fly through them. I just like how the interlocking loops is super unique and really, really cool. It's a nice long ride. The helix in the tunnel doesn't really do a whole lot, but there's some other nice airtime pops throughout the ride. I definitely like the fairly wooded setting. It does use the terrain a little bit, but it's overall really fun, nice, classic ride. And it's still really, really smooth for its age. So yeah, Loch Ness Monster is definitely a great ride, and definitely one of the better air loopers out there. Alright, so coming out the number 7 spot, we have Georgia Scorcher, the B&M stand-up coaster at Six Flags Over Georgia. Now, due to the really bad weather during my trip this year, this was the only new credit I was able to get at the park, and I am still missing 3 credits from the park, including Joker's Funhouse, the Lanaga Mine Train, and Superman Ultimate Flight. But Georgia Scorcher is definitely a really, really good stand-up coaster. It's some pretty intense turns, even some good floater airtime, some nice whip, some really forceful inversions, a solid first drop. It's a smooth ride. It gets a pretty long ride. I also like the color scheme. It's just a really, really fun ride. Even numbs your legs. It's really forceful. It's overall a really good stand-up coaster. Definitely one of the better rides at Six Flags Over Georgia. Alright, so coming at the number 6 spot is going to be Pesto, Busch Gardens Williamsburg. Now, this was my first Skyrocket 2 and my first modern Premier Rides coaster in general. It's a really good ride. It's some nice moments of airtime when you come over the top and when you're going over the drop. And those moments get some nice laterals too, right before and after. And you get some great hang time on that inversion. The non-inverting loop isn't too special, but it's still fun. I like when you're going backwards, and in the back row, you're almost completely at the top of it, that backwards launch. The launches are really solid. It's really compact, really fun. I didn't really have an issue with the comfort colors. They really weren't bad. And it's overall just a really, really fun launch coaster. And I really don't mind these being cloned. Alright, so starting off the top 5, we have Griffin, the B&M dive coaster at Busch Gardens Williamsburg. This ride is awesome. It has this 2 awesome drops, the first of which is, of course, that typical dive coaster drop where it hangs you over and drops you 90 degrees. Dives under a bridge, which is pretty cool. Those 2 elements are really forceful and super whippy. The ride's just super forceful throughout. You get some nice whip going to the mid-course brake run. There's even some nice airtime pops later in the ride. And the drops give some really good airtime too, and also say splashdown, which is really cool. I really like the color scheme. Just the presentation for this ride is great. It's really smooth, and it's just an awesome, great ride. You really just can't go wrong with Griffin. Just such a fun dive coaster. Alright, so at the number 4 spot, we have Apollo's Chariot, the original B&M hypercoaster at Busch Gardens Williamsburg. Now, this ride only has a height of 170 feet, but it is a hyper because it has a drop of 210 feet. And this ride is awesome. It starts off with an amazing drop that really whips you over in the back row. And it gets some good floating in the front. I really like the pre-drop. It kind of makes the drop a little bit better. Then it goes into 2 nice floater hills, and one of them even has this awesome bank off of it. Then it has this awesome helix. The second half of the ride has lots of little smaller hills and a bank turn that goes under the first drop, which actually gives some pretty good whip on some of the turns on this ride. It's pretty forceful, has lots of really good floater, and even some moments of ejector. I love the foresty and terrain setting, and it goes over water. this portion right here, which is really cool. And it's just a really, really fun ride, super smooth, and it still runs really, really well for its age. For being the original Hyper, it's still a really good one, and definitely one of the best coasters at Busch Gardens Williamsburg. Alright, so coming in at the number 3 spot, we have another B&M Hyper coaster, Candemonium at Hershey Park. Now, this was the only new for 2020 coaster that I got on this year. Not that there were many, but so this is the only one. But this is a really, really good ride. It's pretty close with Apollo's Chariot. But I think the reason I gave this the edge is the first hill is super awesome. It's like super sustained. I guess like almost 5 seconds of floater airtime. And it has that cool outward bank turn towards the end of the ride, which is really unique. But they're overall really close. This turn was what I was talking about. It's really fun. But this ride has some great floater airtime. Some decent positive G's on that turnaround leading into that outward bank turn. And on the hammerhead turnaround, this helix at the end isn't super great, but these moments get some pretty good airtime. But it's overall a fun and re-rideable coaster, and definitely a good addition to the park. It's a great centerpiece for the new Chocolate Town area of the park, and it's just a lot of fun. Alright, so coming at the number 2 spot, we had the final coaster at Busch Gardens of Williamsburg. This is Alpine Geyser. It's definitely my favorite coaster in the park. It's an incredible B&M invert, my favorite one personally. It's just crazy intense, crazy forceful, really smooth, super whippy. It still runs really, really well for its age. I did a review recently on this coaster and went more in depth, but just to give my overall thoughts, it's just a really, really good ride. It has some decent theming. The Cobra Roll is insane. The vertical loop's awesome. The Immelman, the Zero Giro, the Corkscrew, all the inversions are some of the best ones on an invert. It's also just super tall, has an awesome drop, and it's just a really good ride, and definitely one of the best B&M coasters out there. And of course, coming in at the number 1 spot is Lightning Rod, the insanely unique launched wooden coaster, well, soon to be hybrid, at Dollywood, and this ride is incredible. I missed out on this coaster during my trip to Dollywood last year, but I came back this year and had 2 days, and I got over 20 rides on this thing. It is just incredible. I did a review on it back in August, so definitely go check that out for my more new thoughts. But in general, this ride is awesome. I love the terrain setting. It's amazing pacing, some of the strongest airtime ever, some insane laterals. It's actually pretty smooth, and it's just a really insanely crazy ride. It's just out of control. The airtime legit hurts. It's so painful. It's probably the strongest airtime in the world. It's just incredible, and it's easily my favorite coaster that I have ridden. So there you have it. As you can see, I had a pretty good year with a pretty decent collection of new credits. I know for a lot of people they did not get nearly as many new credits as they thought, but for me it's really not as bad because I didn't have much planned in the first place besides really Dollywood, which I was still able to do. It definitely wasn't as big as last year, which I got almost 60 new credits last year, but it was still a really solid year, and I rode some really solid new coasters and got back on some really awesome coasters. So there you have it, ranking every new credit I got this year. What are some of your favorite new credits you got this year? Make sure to leave those down below. And as always, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more coaster content coming soon. And I'll see you guys later. Bye.